Her very body was a mystery, a living testament to the strange, the twisted, and the feared. From the moment she arrived at court, whispers surrounded her like a suffocating shroud, a queen so grotesquely deformed that many believed she could only be the product of dark magic, a vessel for witchcraft. Her name was Juana of Austria, and her fate would be as tortured as her form. Spain, the 16th century, a kingdom gilded with the wealth of its colonial conquests, yet poisoned by its own religious fanaticism and the gnawing fear of witches lurking in every shadow. In this ruthless and suspicious world, even the smallest abnormality could become a death sentence. Juana's condition was far from small. Her physical deformities shocked courtiers, priests, and even hardened soldiers who had returned from wars drenched in blood. Bent, shriveled, and bearing features that seemed almost monstrous, Juana became an object of horror and fascination. She was born to powerful blood, descended from the mighty Habsburg line, the empire-building dynasty that claimed dominion over much of Europe. Her father, a stern Spanish nobleman, had expected a healthy princess who might marry into another royal house and strengthen their political alliances. Instead, he received a daughter whose spine twisted as if wrung by demons, whose hands were gnarled into claws, whose face bore an asymmetry that made the uninitiated cross themselves at first sight. This was no fair princess of storybooks, no charming girl to place upon a throne. The Spanish court, steeped in the fever of the Inquisition, saw omens everywhere. Juana's deformities could only be the work of witches, they reasoned, for how else could a royal child be born so terribly marked? Surely her mother had laid with the devil himself, or worse, cursed the child in the womb through dark ritual. The whisper traveled from chambermaids to priests to inquisitors. The queen is bewitched. And in a world where the holy and the unholy battled daily for souls, that rumor was more dangerous than any blade. But Juana was no demon, and no witch. She was a woman of intelligence, a survivor of the cruelest trials nature and humanity could devise. As she grew older, she would learn to wield words as weapons, to guard herself behind a razor-edged wit, and to shape alliances in the shadows. Yet the weight of suspicion never left her side. Born in 1547, Juana of Austria entered a kingdom trembling beneath the iron grip of the Inquisition. Spain had risen to global power after its victory over the Moors and its colonial plundering of the New World. But the triumphs of gold and blood came with a price. The Spanish people lived under a constant terror of heresy, where a slip of the tongue or a glance at the wrong idol might lead to torture, confession, and flames. This was the world that awaited Juana. Her mother, Maria of Portugal, died young and left Juana to the iron-handed rule of her father, Don Fernando of Habsburg, a man convinced that God had cursed his line with this monstrous child. He could hardly bear to look at her, and rumors swelled even inside the palace that he kept her locked away, shielded from prying eyes, lest his enemies use her existence as proof of God's wrath. Juana's earliest years were spent in dim, candlelit chambers, where only a handful of servants were permitted to attend to her. Some pitied her, others recoiled from her touch, as though her flesh might infect them. What twisted Juana's bones? Modern medicine might call it a form of scoliosis compounded with arthrogryposis, but in her own century there were no such words. There was only fear. To be malformed in body was to be marked by Satan. To be twisted of form was to be twisted of soul. For Juana, that meant suspicion would stalk her forever. The Spanish clergy took a keen interest in this living curiosity. Priests and confessors questioned her from childhood, testing her knowledge of prayers and catechisms, searching for any sign of the devil's presence within. Any error, any slip of the tongue, might have been enough to condemn her to trial by the Inquisition. But Juana, even as a girl, understood what was at stake. She memorized every passage, repeated every word with mechanical precision, hiding her terror behind the cold perfection of a royal daughter trained to survive. When she was old enough to stand, Juana was presented before the court. Gasps rippled through the hall, noble ladies raising gloved hands to their mouths, lords averting their eyes. Her presence was a shock, for rumors had long suggested she was a half-beast hidden away in chains. And though she was malformed, she was no beast. Her eyes burned with a keen, almost predatory intelligence. That spark alone frightened many even more than her twisted frame. But Juana's greatest trial had only just begun. As she moved through the Spanish court, she would soon discover that the true monsters were not witches, but men in fine brocade who wielded power as cruelly as any hex. Their knives were sharpened with rumor, their poison poured through prayer, and their hunger for advantage was endless. Juana of Austria, daughter of a mighty house, would have to fight to keep her soul intact, and perhaps, if she dared, to change the fate that had been written for her in the minds of those who called her bewitched. Juana's introduction to courtly life was nothing short of a savage spectacle. Word of her presentation had drawn nobles from across Spain, eager to witness the creature rumored to be the spawn of a witch. Juana felt their eyes upon her as if they were knives, slicing into her twisted body, reading their disgust and morbid curiosity as clearly as any letter. Some whispered prayers under their breath, others laughed behind painted fans. But Juana, despite the pain that riddled every joint and bone, held her head high, refusing to cower. In that moment, she declared a silent war against the world that would deny her dignity. She found one unlikely ally in her cousin, Philip II of Spain. Though known for his rigid piety and iron-fisted rule, Philip saw in Juana not a demon but a political asset, a woman of royal blood, however flawed in flesh, who might yet serve the Habsburg ambitions. Philip arranged for her education to be continued at court, where the best scholars and priests drilled her in Latin, Greek, theology, and the subtle dance of dynastic diplomacy. It was a brutal training, for the expectations placed upon a princess of Spain were crushing. But Juana excelled, her mind quick and relentless, a blade honed to perfection. Yet as her intellect blossomed, so too did the court's suspicion. Whenever plague struck the city, they said it was Juana's presence that invited the devil. When crops failed or storms flooded the fields, some swore they had seen the bent princess praying to false gods. Rumors flowed like blood from a wound, and with the Inquisition ever eager for new prey, Juana lived under the constant threat that any slip might bring torture and trial. Her father, Don Fernando, did nothing to protect her. He had long since withdrawn from any affection, seeing Juana only as a burden, an embarrassment. Her existence was a stain on the Habsburg name, and he made no effort to hide his revulsion. When they crossed paths, he treated her with cold courtesy, as though she were a dangerous guest rather than his daughter. Juana felt his hatred in the silence between them, a silence more brutal than any insult. Yet Juana was not alone. A handful of loyal ladies-in-waiting, perhaps seeing past her broken form to the sharpness of her mind and the dignity she carried, became her protectors. They whispered encouragement when she felt near collapse, carried her upstairs when her twisted legs gave way, and shielded her from the worst of the court's cruelty. Among them was Isabel de Figueroa, a fiery and outspoken woman who refused to be cowed by gossip or priests. Isabel became Juana's confidante, a mirror in which Juana could glimpse something more than the label of bewitched. The bond between them would shape the next chapter of Juana's life. It was Isabel who first dared to suggest that Juana might reclaim her own narrative. If the world would call her a witch, then perhaps she could become something even more dangerous, a queen in her own right, one who harnessed the very rumors meant to destroy her. The idea took root in Juana's mind, sprouting a poisonous, intoxicating bloom. But to do so, she would need power, allies, and a strategy worthy of any general. The first step would be to survive the marriage market. Though many assumed no prince would take a bride so deformed, Juana's royal blood was too valuable to ignore. Suitors arrived from Italy, Austria, even distant Poland, each hoping to secure an alliance with Spain through her hand. When they met her in person, however, many recoiled, unable to look past her twisted form. Her father rejected each match with growing bitterness, unwilling to part with her, yet too ashamed to see her thrive elsewhere. Philip II, pragmatic as ever, had another idea. He proposed that Juana enter a powerful religious order, the Royal Convent of Las Descalzas Reales in Madrid, where she might rule as abbess and secure the loyalty of hundreds of devout women. It was a clever maneuver, placing Juana in a position of influence while removing her from the royal marriage chessboard. There, at least, she could do no damage to the Habsburg name, or so they believed. Juana, seeing no alternative, accepted. But what others saw as exile, she soon recognized as opportunity. At Las Descalzas, she would hold authority, gather resources, and perhaps even rewrite the story of her own monstrosity. In the eyes of the world, she might be a crippled nun locked away from sight. In reality, she would become a force within the Spanish religious establishment, far from the claws of court politics but not powerless. The convent's walls were tall, its doors iron-banded and heavy. As Juana crossed the threshold, her twisted frame shrouded by the black habit of a novice, she felt a chill run through her bones. Outside, the world still called her bewitched, a monster, an omen of evil. But inside these walls, she would begin the first careful steps toward her own destiny, a destiny the Inquisition itself might one day fear. Juana of Austria, daughter of kings, was about to transform from a grotesque curiosity into a player of dangerous games, where faith, politics, and personal vengeance could be wielded like a dagger. And though her body was bent and broken, her mind was as sharp as any blade forged in the fires of war. Inside the convent, Juana discovered a strange and liberating paradox. Here, surrounded by women bound by vows of chastity and poverty, her deformities became almost invisible. The nuns saw suffering as a pathway to divine grace. Her twisted body, once a badge of shame, was now interpreted by some as a sign of God's special favor. Pain was holy after all. Her very existence, marred by so much agony, seemed to them a mirror of Christ's own torment. Juana understood quickly how to use this perception, shaping her image into that of a saintly figure touched by heaven's harshest trials, rather than a creature damned by witchcraft. She played her role with brilliance. She performed acts of charity with the same meticulous precision she had once devoted to Latin declensions. She organized prayers, taught the novices, oversaw donations, and, most importantly, began to build a network of alliances. Through the convent's powerful ties to the Spanish aristocracy, Juana quietly established correspondence with nobles who admired her piety or feared the growing influence of her powerful cousin Philip II. Some offered gifts, others offered secrets, knowing that Juana's confessional ear might one day serve them well. It was not long before she became abbess of Las Descalzas Reales, a post of real power, second only to royal blood in its reach. From this station, Juana commanded respect, money, and most crucially, information. Even members of the Inquisition found themselves tiptoeing around her, unwilling to challenge a woman whose prayers seemed so pure, whose knowledge of Scripture was beyond any flaw. In a twisted irony, the very rumors that had once threatened to destroy her had now made her untouchable. The bewitched queen had turned her curse into armor. But while Juana prospered behind convent walls, Spain trembled. The empire faced enemies on every shore, Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, Ottoman fleets in the Mediterranean, and constant uprisings in its far-flung colonies. Gold poured in from the Americas, but it vanished as quickly as it came, swallowed by endless wars. Famine haunted the countryside. Disease ravaged whole villages. And through it all, the Inquisition fed on fear like a raven on carrion. Juana knew that the line between survival and annihilation had never been so thin. Her deformities still made her vulnerable. One accusation, one slip of the tongue, might bring the black-robed inquisitors pounding on the convent doors. And as abbess, she could not entirely avoid the tangled, dangerous web of politics. Philip II frequently turned to her for advice, trusting her cool mind in matters too delicate for even his closest advisors. Rumors whispered that Juana might act as his hidden confessor, helping to steer the kingdom from her cloister. Her role expanded beyond spiritual guidance. She intervened in disputes among noble families, arbitrated questions of succession, and even corresponded with foreign envoys. Her letters, always measured and precise, showed a talent for strategy worthy of any king's minister, and yet the weight of it pressed heavily on her bent shoulders. At night, she lay in pain, her joints locked in fiery knots, and wondered if she could truly carry the burden fate had laid upon her. Isabel de Figueroa remained by her side, as fierce and loyal as ever. Where Juana's mind spun plans, Isabel became her sword arm, gathering intelligence from visitors, bribing servants, and spreading rumors when they served Juana's ends. Together they made a formidable pair, the twisted queen cloaked in sanctity and the sharp-tongued lady who knew no fear. They understood one another's wounds, one physical, one emotional, and fused their strengths to protect what they had built. Still, the outside world refused to leave them in peace. At the height of a plague outbreak in Madrid, a fanatic monk arrived at the convent gates, crying that Juana was the very cause of God's wrath. He raved that her malformed body was a vessel for the devil, that no amount of prayer could cleanse her, and that the land would know no peace until she was burned at the stake. It was a chilling reminder that centuries of doctrine and fear could never be fully quieted by reason. The monk's claims spread like wildfire. Though the authorities tried to silence him, rumors twisted in the shadows. Some of the nuns themselves began to waver, questioning whether they had truly been serving a saint or sheltering a witch. Juana was forced to confront the very terror she had hoped to leave behind. In a candlelit chamber, she met with the leaders of the convent and spoke with the calm confidence of a queen. "I am marked by God," she declared, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of royal pride. "Not by Satan. If my body is twisted, it is twisted by his will, so that I might show you all the strength to endure suffering. If you cannot accept this, then turn me over to the flames, for I fear no fire." The power of her words, the ice-cold resolve in her stare, broke the spell of panic. Many fell to their knees, weeping in shame. The threat passed for now, but Juana knew how fragile her safety was. In those long nights after the monk's accusations, Juana began to sense that her life could not go on behind walls forever. She had played the role of holy woman to perfection, but perhaps it was time to step beyond the cloister, to confront the poisons of the court that had once tried to bury her alive. If the world still feared her, then perhaps she could use that fear, turn it to her own advantage, and become something greater than any princess, nun, or even queen a legend. Rumors of Juana's defiance in the face of the monk's accusations spread through Spain like wildfire, igniting both admiration and dread. Stories painted her as a woman beyond human weakness, a deformed princess who had stared down the Inquisition with unshakable faith. Whether true or not, those tales made her more dangerous than ever. Some saw in her a holy champion. Others saw a demon whose power was growing unchecked. Juana herself understood that legends could be sharpened into weapons. She began to act accordingly, sending carefully crafted letters to Philip II that hinted at her willingness to return to court should he ever require her counsel in person. Philip, overburdened by rebellion and war, recognized the strategic value of his cousin's iron spirit and agreed to bring her closer into the political fold. He invited her to attend select councils, hidden behind veils and screens, so that foreign envoys might not recoil at the sight of her twisted form. Juana stepped through these doors with the confidence of one who had survived far worse humiliations. Her reappearance at court was like dropping a wolf among sheep. Nobles who had once ridiculed her were now forced to treat her with respect, even fear, for she carried Philip's confidence and a reputation for fearsome intelligence. She advised on questions of land disputes, proposed reforms to the kingdom's ailing finances, and even suggested new alliances to counter Protestant threats. Her keen understanding of faith, war, and statecraft made her invaluable. Yet with every victory, Juana also drew fresh enemies. Men who might have courted her in her youth now hated her for her power. Women who once sneered at her twisted spine now whispered venom behind her back, envious of the voice she had at Philip's ear. Priests who had suspected her of witchcraft watched with renewed suspicion, unable to reconcile the image of a crippled girl with the brilliance of a political master. Juana moved among them like a phantom, no longer hiding her deformities, but wearing them like a banner of survival. Her father, Don Fernando, remained a distant, cold presence, aging and embittered in his own estates. He refused to acknowledge Juana's triumph, insisting she was a freak who had been granted too much influence. In secret, he wrote to allies in the Inquisition, suggesting that Juana's growing power might be a sign of demonic favor. These accusations, though never spoken in public, filtered through the tangled web of informants and spies. Juana soon learned that even blood was no shield against betrayal. Meanwhile, Isabel de Figueroa continued to guard her friend's flank, sniffing out plots and paying off informants. Her skills grew as ruthless as any assassin's blade. Together, Juana and Isabel built an informal intelligence network that rivaled the king's own. They recruited loyal scribes, loyal merchants, even cooks and maids to pass them scraps of information. Through this network, Juana learned of an especially dangerous scheme, that some in the Inquisition planned to accuse her of consorting with Moors and Jews, a heresy that could not be explained away by saintly suffering. For Juana, this was the deepest terror, for her mother's Portuguese ancestry had included distant Jewish roots, something whispered about for decades. The Inquisition could seize on this rumor like wolves tearing into fresh meat. Juana realized she must act, and act swiftly. She began to gather written testimony from respected bishops and nobles, attesting to her Christian faith. She called on witnesses to speak of her tireless devotion in the convent. She even persuaded a high-ranking inquisitor, a man rumored to harbor secret doubts about the excesses of the Holy Office, to stand as her silent protector. But the threat did not pass quietly. One night, Isabel burst into Juana's chambers with news that chilled the very marrow of her bones. An arrest warrant had been signed in secret, naming Juana as a witch, heretic, and conspirator. They had mere hours before the black-robed inquisitors would arrive at the convent to drag her to a dungeon. Juana did not falter. She called for the abbess's robes she had once worn, determined to meet her enemies not as a princess, but as the holy woman they themselves had helped to crown. Draped in black, with her twisted frame silhouetted against candlelight, she looked almost spectral. With Isabel and a handful of loyal guards, she made her way to the royal palace to confront Philip II directly. The king, roused from uneasy sleep, was shocked to see his cousin appear in the dead of night. But Juana's eyes burned with the same terrible light he had first noticed in their childhood. She spoke with ruthless clarity, laying out the web of conspiracies, the false charges, and the men behind them. She reminded him that his kingdom needed her now more than ever, that to lose her to the Inquisition's fires would be to lose a mind too sharp to replace. Philip hesitated, torn between faith and family, but at last he ordered the inquisitors to stand down. Juana was granted royal protection, a decree so powerful even the Inquisition dared not cross it. Yet the price was high. She would have to leave the convent, abandon the women she had led, and remain at court under Philip's watchful eye. As dawn broke over Madrid, Juana felt a tremor of dread. She had survived countless threats, twisted her curse into armor, and outplayed the monsters of her age. But returning to court would mean stepping once more into a nest of vipers, where knives waited in every smile and poison flowed through every goblet. Still, she lifted her chin. If fate had decreed she was a witch, then perhaps she would wield that power and show the world that its fears could be far more terrifying than any sorcery. Juana's return to court was nothing short of an earthquake. Gone was the hidden, cloistered abbess. In her place stood a woman who had survived the Inquisition's noose and returned with the king's blessing. Her twisted figure, once an object of mockery, now inspired a different kind of awe, the awe one reserves for survivors of the impossible. The courtiers, those same poisonous tongues that had called her bewitched, were forced to bow before her presence. Even if they loathed her, they dared not move against a woman who had stared down the fires of the Inquisition and walked away untouched. Philip II placed Juana in a semi-official advisory role, giving her a seat on private councils, where her insight could not be ignored. Behind heavy tapestries and gilded walls, Juana's voice began to shape decisions of war and peace, trade and taxes, succession and law. In her twisted hands lay the fate of provinces and nobles alike. She counseled moderation when Philip burned with dreams of total conquest, reminding him that even a king's power had limits. Her grasp of human nature was cold and precise, born from a life where every moment had been a test of survival. But Juana's influence brought new, more cunning enemies. The Inquisition, humiliated by its failure to seize her, waited patiently for another chance to pounce. Her father, Don Fernando, still obsessed with purging the shame of his daughter's existence, continued to whisper poison in the ears of bishops and inquisitors. Among the powerful lords, some grew terrified that Juana's counsel might curb their privileges or expose their corruption. They began to plot, forming uneasy alliances in the dark corners of palaces and monasteries, convinced that one day they would find a way to end her. Juana knew this. Every smile, every courtesy, felt like a mask stretched over a dagger. She trusted almost no one, save Isabel, whose loyalty had been tempered in fire and tears. Together they built yet another circle of informants, maids, priests, even confessors who would report to Juana instead of their official masters. If the court thought it could outmaneuver the bewitched queen, they would find she was far more dangerous than they had ever feared. But one enemy came from within her own frail body. Her health began to falter. The years of pain, of twisted bones and inflamed joints, took a crushing toll. Fevers gripped her in the night, leaving her delirious, raving about monsters in the walls and flames licking at her feet. At times, she could not walk for days. Yet she refused to surrender her place at Philip's side, forcing herself to rise even when the pain made her vision swim. The price of power, she believed, was agony. As Juana's influence grew, her legend grew with it. They called her La Santa Retorcida, the Holy Twisted One. Some claimed she had the ear of angels, others that she communed with demons. The line between rumor and reality blurred until no one could separate them. And Juana, ever the strategist, leaned into that confusion, allowing people to believe what they wished, so long as they feared crossing her. One day, Philip asked Juana to negotiate a truce with rebellious nobles in Aragon. It was an impossible task, for the lords there had already declared their refusal to submit to Madrid's growing power. Juana agreed, traveling in a litter borne by loyal guards, her twisted body covered in layers of black velvet, her face drawn but determined. When she arrived, the nobles nearly choked on their own shock. The Witch Queen had come in person to judge them. She gathered them in the hall of an ancient fortress, candles flickering in the gloom. With a voice as cold as iron, she laid out their options: submit to the king's rule or face ruin. She did not shout. She did not threaten with the fires of God. Instead, she spoke of faith, of duty, of legacy, things that cut deeper than any blade. By the time she finished, hardened warriors who had once sworn to fight to the death knelt before her, tears in their eyes. Juana returned to Madrid in triumph, yet her victories felt increasingly hollow. Each success brought her only more suspicion, more plots, more venom. She longed for the quiet of Las Descalzas, for the sanctuary of prayer where no one measured her worth by the alliances she could forge or the enemies she could break. But she could not leave. Her name, her legend, had become too powerful to ever retreat again. Her health continued to crumble. At night, she would collapse into Isabel's arms, feverish and trembling, gasping that the devil was hunting her dreams. Sometimes she believed it. Sometimes she did not care. The pain had become so absolute, it blurred the difference between faith and madness. Yet each morning she rose, donned her heavy gowns, and went to war once more with the wolves of court. And so, the woman who had once been hidden away for her twisted flesh stood as one of the most feared and respected voices in the kingdom, a living symbol of Spain's own contradictions, pious and brutal, glorious and damned. Juana had remade herself into a legend, but legends are as fragile as glass, and she sensed that one final reckoning still waited for her beyond the horizon. Juana's last years were marked by a gathering sense of doom, as if the very fabric of her life was coming undone. Though Philip continued to trust her counsel, the court grew ever more poisonous, its intrigues deeper than the darkest well. The Inquisition, shamed by its earlier failure to break her, sharpened its claws yet again. Quiet inquiries began to swirl. How could a woman so deformed, so cursed by God, rise to such influence without infernal aid? Such questions were like sparks on dry straw. One winter night, as Juana lay fevered in her chambers, a plot was finally put into motion. Her enemies had gathered enough support to demand a formal investigation by the Holy Office. They claimed new evidence of witchcraft, letters distorted, prayers corrupted, dreams infected with diabolical signs. Juana was too weak to rise from her bed when the inquisitors came, led by a fanatical friar who had sworn to purge Spain of every imagined corruption. Isabel fought to block their way, but she could do nothing against the authority of the Holy Office. They entered Juana's chamber with torches and iron chains, their faces hidden behind grim masks of righteous fury. Juana, drenched in sweat and shivering, looked up at them with eyes that still burned, even through her agony. "You think you will break me," she rasped, voice ragged with fever. "But I was broken before you ever drew breath. There is nothing left for you to destroy." They seized her anyway, carrying her from the palace like a sack of refuse, ignoring the frantic pleas of her allies. At dawn, News spread through Madrid that Juana of Austria, the bewitched queen, had been taken at last. Some wept, others crossed themselves in relief, but all knew the legend was ending. In the dungeons of the Inquisition, Juana endured tortures meant to force a confession of witchcraft. They twisted her already twisted limbs, burned her feet, starved her, and forced her to witness the torment of those loyal to her. Yet her voice remained unbroken. No matter what agonies they inflicted, she refused to confess, even as infection and fever gnawed at her strength. Word reached Philip, who was away dealing with the collapse of his armies in Flanders. Horrified by the betrayal of his own royal blood, he ordered Juana's immediate release, but the command came too late. Juana was dying. The inquisitors, having realized their prize was slipping through their fingers, tried to nurse her back to health so she might stand a proper trial. But nature had claimed her faster than any torturer's hand. On a cold March evening, in the damp dark of her cell, Juana drew her final breaths. Isabel was allowed to see her one last time. She found Juana shivering, her skin like wax, her twisted frame lying on filthy straw. Yet her eyes were still those of a queen unbowed, even at the gates of death. "Tell them," Juana whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of a dying torch, "that I was no witch. Tell them I was their mirror, showing them what they feared in themselves." And with that, Juana of Austria, the woman they once called bewitched, was gone. Her death shocked the kingdom. Philip, guilt and rage twisting his own heart, demanded an inquiry into the Inquisition's abuses, though in the end nothing changed. The priests offered prayers for Juana's soul but would not admit wrongdoing. The common people, however, began to tell stories of her courage, of her terrible dignity, of a spirit too fierce to bend. Over the decades, her legend grew. They said the twisted queen had carried the wounds of all Spain on her broken back, a saint and a sinner at once, unbowed even by death. Juana was buried in a royal crypt, but to many, her true resting place was in their collective memory as a woman who had fought every force bent on her destruction and refused to be crushed. The convent she once ruled at Las Descalzas carried on in her name, its sisters invoking her as a model of fortitude. Rumors that she had left secret writings, warnings of corruption, blueprints for resistance lingered for generations. In the centuries that followed, Spain tried to forget its cruelest deeds, but Juana's story would not die. Her name became a whisper of defiance, a ghost that stalked the corridors of power. And in that haunting, there was a lesson that the truest monsters often sat on thrones, cloaked in fine robes and pious words, while those they branded as witches were sometimes the only souls brave enough to stand against them. Even today, Juana's story raises a chilling question. How many other voices were silenced by fear, their courage lost to time, because they were different? History is written by the victors, but its truest lessons belong to the broken, the deformed, the bewitched, those who refused to kneel, even when the world demanded their destruction. If Juana of Austria has a legacy, it is this, that survival itself can be the most terrifying kind of magic. If you wish to see more long-form scripts with these same haunting, powerful themes, tell me I am ready to breathe life into history's forgotten ghosts.